Chapter 38. The northern massif loomed over them, row after row of cliffs and hills, climbing eventually to a plain high above. The open desert had given way to a narrow road, running between rocky outcrops and cliffs, and angling upwards through the first foothills. At an elevation 150 meters above the desert floor, there was a level section cut by nature into the sheer walls of the cliffs, cutting back to run in a rough north-south alignment. The town of Marshava stood there. The town was a market centre for the Aridi farmers who lived and worked in the foothills and the plains below the massif. Its normal population was around 500, but it grew to 800 or 900 in market weeks, when herdsmen and farmers came in from outlying areas and neighbouring hill villages to trade their goods. It was a perfect temporary base for the Tuolagi warriors, large enough to provide accommodation for them and forage for their animals, and well stocked with foodstuffs brought into the market and stored in the town's warehouses. The buildings were the usual white-painted mud brick houses, mostly single-story structures with flat roofs, where the occupants could enjoy the cool air at the end of the day and, on occasion, sleep during the hottest nights. But there were also many dwellings cut into the face of the cliffs themselves, their entrances weathered and worn by the years, indicating that they were ancient. For the most part, these were used as storehouses for the food and other goods traded in the town. But some were dwellings, and, as the prisoners filed into the town behind their guards, Holt saw several where the signs of human occupation were obvious. Women, burdened with jars containing the family's water supply, climbed access ladders to the higher entrances, and the smoke of cook fires issued from carefully cut smoke holes in the face of the rock. On some, washed garments had been hung on long, slender poles and pushed out into the hot air to dry, the clothes fluttering like pennants in the slight breeze that moved through the canyons. The 3-day march to Marshava hadn't been a pleasant one. They had been led on long ropes tied to the saddles of their guards, forced to jog awkwardly in order to keep up. If anyone fell, and inevitably they did, since they were kept off balance by having their hands tied together in front of them, he was immediately surrounded by riders jabbing with lance points or striking down at them with the butts of their spears. After a few kilometres, Holt noticed that the riders of the horses they were tied to were expert at sudden, unexpected changes of pace or direction, calculated to throw the prisoners off balance so that they would fall. Evelyn was the exception. As Selathan had predicted, the Tuolagi saw her as an investment to be protected, and she suffered none of this brutality. She was even given a small horse to ride, although her hands remained bound and the horse was led by a Tuolagi warrior, constantly on the alert for any sign that she might try to escape. The 2 rangers fared the worst. They were foreigners and so regarded with contempt by the Tuolagi. Worse, their uncanny accuracy during the brief attack had made them hated men. Most of the Tuolagi had at least one friend who had suffered at the wrong end of a ranger arrow, and the 2 longbows carried by Holt and Gillen marked them out as the culprits. Both men were bruised and battered by the time they reached Marshava. Holt's left cheek was a massive bruise, and the eye was nearly closed, courtesy of a Tuolagi fist. Gillen had bled profusely from a head wound inflicted by a small club. The crusted blood matted his hair and face. It seemed that the presence of the 2 rangers diverted the Tuolagi's attention from their original victim, Erak. He and Svengel were generally left alone, aside from the almost casual beating with spear butts when they slipped and fell. Selathan also fared better than the others. Usal knew his value as a hostage, whereas the Araluans were an unknown quantity in that area. Horace, fit, athletic, and light on his feet, gave their guards the fewest opportunities to beat him, although on one occasion an angry Tuolagi, furious that Horace misunderstood an order to kneel, slashed his dagger across the young man's face, opening a thin, shallow cut on his right cheek. The wound was superficial, but as Evelyn treated it that evening, Horace shamelessly pretended that it was more painful than it really was. He enjoyed the touch of her ministering hands. Holt and Gillen, bruised and weary, watched as she washed the wound and gently patted it dry. Horace did a wonderful job of pretending to bear great pain with stoic bravery. Holt shook his head in disgust. "What a faker," he said to Gillen. The young ranger nodded. "Yes, he's really making a meal of it, isn't he?" He paused, then added a little ruefully, "Wish I'd thought of it first." Holt's one good eye glared round at him. Muttering under his breath, the grey-haired ranger shuffled away a few paces, disgusted now with his former pupil. "Young men," he snorted to Erak. "They think a pretty face can cure every ill." "Some of us can remember back that far, Holt," Erak told him with a grin. "I suppose that's all far behind an old hack like you. Svengel told me you were settling down. Some plump, motherly widow seizing her last chance with a broken-down old greybeard, is she?" Erak, of course, had been told by Svengel that Holt had recently married a great beauty. But he enjoyed getting a reaction from the smaller man. Holt's one-eyed stare locked onto the Oberjarl. "When we get back, I'd advise you not to refer to Pauline as a plump, motherly widow in her hearing. She's very good with the dagger she carries, and you need your ears to keep that ridiculous helmet of yours in place." Now the joking was stilled as they stumbled into Marshavar at the end of an exhausting day's march. The Aridi townspeople looked at the new arrivals with dull, uninterested eyes. They had no sympathy for the prisoners. The Tuolagi's invasion of their town would leave them penniless and hungry. It would take several seasons to replace the food and other provisions that the invaders were helping themselves to. The town was in shadow, as the sun was now hidden behind the high cliffs. They were led through the main square, where the market was held, to one of the warehouse caves at the rear of the town. The long lead ropes were removed and their hands were untied. "Looks like we've arrived at wherever we're going," Horace said. A Tuolagi cursed him and told him to hold his foreign tongue. The prisoners were shoved unceremoniously into the empty warehouse, and a guard was mounted outside the entrance. A few minutes later, food, water, and blankets were brought to the captives. Then the outer door was slammed shut and locked, and they were left alone. "So, what happens now?" Gillen wondered aloud. He didn't have to wonder long. Less than an hour later, they heard the rattle of a key in the lock, and the door swung open. It was now full dark outside, and the interior was lit by the single candle. In the doorway, they could just make out a dim, bulky figure. Then he shoved through the narrow door, having to turn sideways to do so, and strode into the centre of the large room they were in. A half-dozen armed Tuolagi followed him, fingering the hilts of their curved swords, looking around the room, alert for any sign of rebellion from the prisoners. Finally, Usal entered as well, but none of the prisoners had eyes for him. They were all watching the heavily built, bearded Scandian, who had led the way into their cell. "Torshak!" Svengel said. Angrily, he started to rise from the sand floor of the cave. Immediately, 3 of the Tuolagi drew their swords, and the familiar, warning shring noise ran through the cave. Erak's hand shot out and gripped Svengel's forearm, forcing him back down. "Sit easy, Svengel," he said. "Can't you see he wants an excuse to kill you?" "Very astute, Erak," the renegade replied. His voice was surprisingly smooth and well modulated for a Scandian. Most were seamen and used to having to bellow above storm and wind. Toshak gestured to the guards, and the swords were returned to their scabbards. Usal, his lower face still shrouded by the blue veil, watched the interplay between the two big men, his head moving from one to the other, his dark eyes unblinking. Like a hawk, Holt thought. Then he amended the concept. Or a vulture. "So, Toshak, you're finally showing your face. I thought you'd turn out to be the cowardly traitor behind all this." Erak's voice was even and controlled, but he couldn't match the smoothness of his enemy's delivery. Toshak smiled. "As I say, Oberjal, very astute. But of course, anyone can be clever in hindsight. It's a pity you didn't show such keen perception a little earlier. You might have avoided my trap. You'd hardly gain any credit for saying, 'I knew it was you all along,' when I walk into the room, do you? Whether I knew or not, the fact remains you're a traitor, and you deserve to die." "Well, yes, but of course, one man's traitor is another man's patriot, as they say, and I'm afraid any dying is going to be done by you." "Which means you'll lose the ransom money," Holt interrupted. He looked at the Tuolagi leader. "How does your comrade in arms feel about that? Do you want to give up 60,000 reals of silver, Usal?" The Tuolagi stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. He measured himself against the ranger and glared down at the shorter man. His finger jabbed Holt in the chest, emphasizing his words. "You do not call me Usal," he snapped. "You address me as Asik Usal, or as Excellence. Do you understand me, you insolent foreigner?" Holt cocked his head to one side, considering the question, even though it had been rhetorical. "What I understand," he said, "is that there is very little about you that is excellent, and that Asik is a term of honor. There's nothing honorable in a man who hides his face behind a woman's blue hanky." The fury flared more brightly in Usal's eyes. Holt was watching them carefully. He always watched an enemy's eyes, and in Usal's case, they were the only feature visible. As Usal swung his fist backhanded at him, Holt was ready. He swayed slightly to his right, and the blow passed by harmlessly. Usal, expecting to meet resistance, staggered with the follow-through. Burning with fury, he stepped closer to Holt to strike at him again. Toshak raised his hand to stop him. "Wait," he said. He peered more closely at Holt, studying the swollen, bruised face. "You're the ranger, aren't you? Holt, that's your name. I remember hearing about you now. You made trouble in Scandia 3 years ago, and now you're here. You just get in the way on every continent, don't you? And I suppose that's the other one who is in Scandia with you." He gestured to Gillen. Truth be told, Toshak had never seen either ranger. He simply knew that Holt's assistant had been a younger man. "Actually," Gillen began, but Holt cut him off. "That's right," he said quickly. Gillen looked at him, a little surprised, but he said nothing further. Toshak turned to Usal now. "These are the archers, the ones who killed so many," he said. The Tuolagi nodded. "My men wanted to kill them, but they might be worth a ransom." Toshak shook his head. "Nobody will pay to have them back," he said. "Rangers are troublemakers, and they're dangerous. Best they're killed as soon as possible." "I can ransom them," Evelyn said in the deathly silence that fell over the room. I'm a diplomat. I'm close to the king of Araluan. I can arrange to have a large ransom paid for these men. Toshak eyed her curiously. He hadn't actually been present in Hallisholm during the war with the Temujai, but he had heard tales of what had taken place. Wild stories about a girl who had been with the Rangers, a high-ranking Araluan girl. It could be this one, he thought. Then he shrugged. Her identity was immaterial. What was important was what had been found in her belongings. "You'll do that anyway," he said, "whether we kill them or not." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, then stopped as she saw what he was holding. The draft for the Salassian Council. "It's worthless without a seal," she told him. "But you know where to find one, don't you?" he asked. Evelyn met his gaze unflinchingly. Just before they had surrendered, she had hidden the seal under a rock outcrop in the saucer-shaped depression. She was glad now that she had done so. She said nothing, not trusting her voice. Toshak nodded. Her silence confirmed his suspicion. He turned to Yusal. "Asik Yusal, how would you convince this girl to find the seal she appears to have misplaced?" Yusal's eyes crinkled, and the veil moved slightly over his face. Evelyn realized he was smiling. The Tuolagi had watched the captives closely all the way to Marshavar. He hadn't missed the byplay between the girl and the young warrior. He pointed to Horace now. "If we begin to peel the skin from this one, I think she might remember," he said. He chuckled. His harsh, unpleasant voice made it an ugly sound. Evelyn froze, looking helplessly at Horace. She knew she would never stand by and see him tortured. But if she made out the warrant, they would all die anyway. "Toshak!" It was Svengel, his voice soft and questioning. The rebel Scandian looked at him, his eyebrows raised. Svengel continued. "How about you and me? We have a little wrestle together, just for fun." "Fun?" repeated Toshak. Svengel smiled winningly. "Yes, I think it would be such fun to tear that ugly head off your shoulders. And your beaky blue-faced friends, too." He spat the last words out, switching his glare to Yusal. Toshak raised an eyebrow. "You should have kept your mouth shut, Svengel. I might have let you live. But now I see how determined you are, well—" He paused, looking around the tense group who faced him. "Let's just recap where we stand, shall we?" he said. He indicated Selathen. "The Wakir is going to be ransomed. He gets off lightly, but I have no argument with him. On the other hand, I do have one with Erak and Svengel, so they're going to die. You two rangers as well." He pointed at Horace next. "You're going to have your skin peeled, and the young lady here is going to pay us a large amount of money for the privilege of listening to your screams." He smiled around at them all. "Have I missed anyone? No? Well, have a nice night thinking on it." The smile disappeared. He jerked his head at Yusal, and the two of them turned. Then the Tuolagi leader, struck by a thought, stopped and turned back. He held up his left hand as if asking for their attention and moved back towards them. "There was one more thing," he said. Then he spat an order to his guards, and the two of them gripped Holt by the arms, forcing him forward and down until he was on his knees in front of Yusal. The Tuolagi Asik then rained closed-fist blows on Holt's face, left and right, striking again and again until the ranger's face was cut and bleeding and his head lolled to one side. Toshak watched, amused. Erak started to move forward to intervene, but the point of a saber in his belly stopped him. Finally, Yusal stepped back, breathing heavily. "Let him go," he told the men holding Holt. They released him, and he crumpled to the sand, face down and semi-conscious. "Not so light on your feet now, are you?" Toshak said to the slumped figure. Yusal uttered a short bark of laughter, and together they turned and left the room. The guards, hands on their weapons, backed out after them, slamming the door. In the ensuing silence, the prisoners heard the key rattle in the lock. Gillen let go a deep, pent-up breath and moved quickly to kneel beside his semi-conscious friend. Gently, he rolled Holt over and began cleaning the mixture of sand and blood from his face. Evelyn joined him, her hands light and delicate. Horace brought over the water skin that had been left with them and handed it to Evelyn. He watched as she gently washed Holt's face. Horace was worried. He had never seen Holt defeated before. Holt was always in control of the situation. Holt always knew what to do next. "I think we're in big trouble," he said. Then they all started as Holt moved, raising his hand and trying to sit up. Evelyn held him down and he stopped his efforts. But he spoke, his voice thick and somewhat slurred by his swollen mouth and face. "They're forgetting one thing," he said. There was a light of defiance in his good eye. The other was now completely closed. The others all exchanged a glance. They could see no positive side to their predicament. "And what might that be, Holt?" Evelyn asked him, willing to humour him. Holt caught the tone in her voice and glared at her. Then he said with some force, "Will's still out there somewhere.